I'm Kadambri Raghukumar, and I've called Aotearoa, New Zealand home for about 15 years now. One of the many things that I love about this place is the thriving art scene. But in 2021, I want to get to know more artists who represent people like myself.
A lot of people talk about girl power and how I make this big-scaled installation. It's not about being big, it's not about being strong, it's about understanding the system.
Is that where you want it, or do you want it to go higher?
Maybe left a little bit.
A little bit towards my left, yeah?
Yeah.
When I first saw Yona Lee's large-scale metal installations, I honestly couldn't wrap my head around how it all comes together, let alone how the mechanics of the tools even work. But luckily for me, the confusion or the riddle is such a big part of the appeal of her work.
I was born in South Korea. I came to New Zealand when I was like 11. Back in Korea, everything was about music in my life. I was very serious, and I started learning the cello when I was 7, being part of the orchestra, playing the concerts, and got into music school. But I think it was like last minute where I kind of decided I want to try something new, and then I applied to art school. I've never thought of becoming an artist, especially working in this metal workshops.
You're literally the only woman in this entire space.
Yeah.
How do you find yourself in a place like this?
I think the project led me to these places. I think I had a welder just welding everything for me. And then it got to a point where I just sort of had to learn. I've never expected to be here for this long. This environment is male-dominated, and they're very loud. So it took a while for me to get used to working in the environment, but people have been really nice. It's really hard to learn the structural knowledge unless you sort of spend time with them.
Wielding power tools and hanging out behind a welder's mask is just part of her daily routine. And I can now safely say neither is it easy nor always pleasant.
You realize I've never done this before, right? I have no idea. I mean, welding and me.
Basically, you're heating material with the gun, and then hold it quite close.
Okay.
Basically, you should heat the metal, and then you'll see sort of it goes a bit red around circle, and they'll melt them together.
And why does it all go black like that?
Everything blacks out, and then
you didn't tell me that bit.
Sorry about that.
I thought I lost my vision for a second.
Yeah?
Stuck.
It's stuck. It's quite normal.
I'll stick to television work.
The structure that I've learned from being in the workshops is this engineering way of thinking, understanding how the materials work and developing your own system. And once you have that, making a show that's as big as a building or as small as an object, there's not much difference between the two. And I think working at the workshop where Keith is and learning the skills definitely shaped my project, my practice over the years.
I can remember when you turned up at Drake and Wrigley down at Galway Street, and you kind of just walked in and kind of wanted to take over, and I had to sort of steer you in the right direction to be able to work this. Take another little bit of that.
A little bit more? He's been helping me for the past 10 years, and sort of inviting him to the opening really sort of gave him the insight into the context where the work was going. Because he probably thought that I was wasting materials. He looked really excited and he seemed very happy. So in 2016, I did an art residency in Seoul. I didn't know what I was going to make at the time, but I knew it was quite important for me to be back in Korea to rethink about my practice. I sort of stayed there for about a year, and it really helped me to unpack some of those questions that I had myself. Being immigrated, when you were, at the time, teens, where you sort of like build your identity and sense of home and have that displacement, that was very challenging. I feel very settled now, but it took many years to process that. I worked on this in-transit project. I only had 5 days to install, and I had to finish and I had deadline. So like I slept on the bed that I installed as part of the work, and that space, it was very industrial, underground. It's not really a nice place to sleep. I slept there about like 3 or 4 nights. I was quite surprised how nice the experience was. Then I realized that I was actually making like a livable structure. And this functional language was something that I wanted to push further to a Te exhibition. It was the first show where there was the interactive element of the work, and it was such a pleasure to see how public engaged with your work, because I always wanted to make work that overcomes the boundaries of different culture or language and gender, whatever, That element of my work definitely ties back to music.
Yona doesn't play the cello much anymore, but these intriguing metal compositions seem to be filling that gap pretty well. And they've grabbed the attention of galleries from across New Zealand to Seoul to Sydney.
I don't really try to change my practice for the purpose of changing it. I'm all about responding to the space and the context, and through that process, the work just kind of naturally progress.
The ultimate outcome that I'm looking for in my work is that people in the Pacific community feel very empowered by the things that I do.
I got to see Yuki's talk at the Auckland Art Fair in summer. It was packed out with people. She's clearly had a super busy year after being selected for Venice Biennale, one of the world's biggest art fairs. But I managed to squeeze in a couple of hours with her at her studio, here in this industrial estate in Henderson, Auckland.
The Samoan writer Albert Wendt talks about the relationship between the Samoan space of Va to the Japanese space of Ma or Wa, meaning that it's not necessarily a space that separates, but it's a space that connects two entities together. It's to dismantle this binary space, and it allows for more nuanced negotiation. And I thought it was really interesting, and then I began to sort of apply that idea into like my own ethnic background, being, Samoan mother and Japanese father. And we also have to sort of realize that all these borders that are drawn around the world are all a result of colonialism. So this binary division between man, woman, straight, gay, Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, these are boundaries that were drawn up by, colonialism. And if you didn't kind of fit into these, binary divisions, that there was something wrong with you, and there, it's something to be fetishized and so on and so forth. Those are the kinds of layered notions of gender that I wanted to talk about in my work, and that's what I did back in 2005. I agreed to re-edition and to represent that work at the Auckland Art Fair because of the current social and cultural climate that we're in here in Aotearoa, in the Pacific and around the world, with regards to trans and transhuman rights, and I kind of felt like the history was repeating itself, and I felt that it was an appropriate time to maybe perhaps revisit that body of work with fresh eyes. And when I made this work back in 2005, and when I talk about this experience to other Fa'afafines and other trans people, unfortunately, these kinds of experiences that I had continues to be re-perpetuated. And unfortunately, in this day and age, Samoan people have internalized those gender stereotypes, which is really bad. And these kinds of gender stereotypes is also something that's also reinforced through how the government, acknowledges gender, which is through the sex, that your gender is supposedly, determined by your sexual anatomical makeup. And then so I would like to look at the world, in a more fluid way, beyond, man-made boundaries.
In these pandemic times, Yuki chose to jump in the deep end of researching Aotearoa's own quarantine history. The result is a set of lenticular photographs.
Quarantine Islands came about actually looking at the history of leprosy management in Samoa. So during the German and the New Zealand occupation of the independent state of Samoa, back then it was Western Samoa, there was an islet called Nu'utele off the district of Alepata that was designated for quarantining Samoan people with leprosy. So during the New Zealand administration of Samoa at that time, here in Aotearoa, there was Otamahua, Quail Island, which is off Littleton Harbour, which established the first leprosy colony. I guess here in Aotearoa, they didn't want, leprosy people around, so they would put them in, Otamahua, Quail Island, and they would move them again to another island, to another colony in Samoa, to Nu'utele, and then subsequently to Makongai Island in Fiji, and only a few returned. And it's this idea that, when you think of an island, it's always associated with the stigma of being isolated, undeveloped, at the periphery, which is exactly how the New Zealand colonial government thought of about the Pacific Islands. Yeah, so people almost sort of project their fears onto the islands. When COVID hit and I began to think about diseases and quarantine and so on and so forth, I essentially wanted to use these islands across Aotearoa to actually tell a Samoan story. And this is Mokopuna, Leper Island, as we've spoken before.
Yep.
So I'm going to do this so the camera can get the 3D thing happening. I like this part here because it reminds you of like the Japanese rock garden.
Yeah, and you can really see the dimensions in there, can't you? The distance between the rocks, and
Yeah.
sort of makes you feel like you want to step into it.
Yes, that's the idea.
So at no point did you ever show your face, though, in this entire series, though? They're all shots from
No,
the back,
because
aren't
it's
they?
really about, thinking about what she's looking at
Yeah.
or where she's at.
New Zealand has had a presence at the Venice Biennale since 2001. Yuki represents many firsts for New Zealand, but it's not the only thing that solidifies her place in the art world here or internationally.
I am the first Pasifika artist, the first Asian artist, the first trans, the first Fa'afafine artist to be selected to represent the Aotearoa New Zealand Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. For me, it breaks the glass ceiling, particularly, for the Pacific arts community who have struggled to gain such prestigious recognition. But at the same time, there are also conversations about the reason why I'm in this position of, having to represent the Aotearoa New Zealand Pavilion is because of all of my minority points. That there are certain, community of people in Aotearoa, most likely who are cisgender, heterosexual, and Pākehā, who often think that their privileges are being taken away because of somebody like me representing their country, which is really sad because, in an age where, we need to think critically about equity, across all kinds of human expression. I would have thought that, my selection to this position will be something that's moving forward, and I hope it is. So I do feel like a sense of responsibility that I have to give it my best, to keep that door open for people like myself, so that in the near future, there will be a constant stream of people like myself who gets to represent this country that is diverse with the utmost respect to tangata whenua.
Dunedin's made up of migrants, and mana whenua were here first, but that's sort of been covered over. There isn't actually a lot of presence from a Māori perspective in Dunedin.
meeting Simon Kaan and seeing him at work was something that's been long overdue for me. I've been following his work from when I first came to New Zealand 15 years ago. I'm fascinated with how he draws from both his Māori and Chinese heritage. We finally get a chance to meet in Dunedin. Now, I'm not made for the cold, but luckily the weather's on our side.
Dunedin's always been quite an art hub. You can be a full-time artist without having to have second jobs to pay, high rents and mortgages and things like that. There's a lot of artists who can, have a good lifestyle down here and make art. It's got a best of both worlds, I think. You've got your isolation, there's enough stimulus happening around if you want it. My being and my art, I don't think it would work in a large city, whether it's aesthetically or just the spirit of the work, it would sort of kill it. So like a lot of people picture my studio as being this really tranquil, still, calm space. But the work wouldn't be able to exist in that. It wouldn't have that thing to juxtapose. And this is sort of part of my personality, which is fairly chaotic and all over the place as well. So there's a certain amount of unknown or unseen tension within the work that comes from that working method that I have. I think there's a lot of chaos in the world and people's minds. And these works, the function of them is to sort of find a pause or an ease in that. This peacefulness comes from this chaos.
Do you ever find the urge to kind of disrupt that?
Yeah, sometimes I do. And I just, nobody ever sees that work. There'll be some subtleties, like that work there I did probably 4 years ago. So that's that, I suppose, the function or the purpose of having that long gestation of practice where you can just, and having a large space like this where it doesn't need to get filed away, you can just observe 10 years work and as you just pivot around, and they can all start to keep informing each other. That connection to ocean and place was, something that was there before I was making artwork. I think my art practice and the way I navigate where I am now is different from when I was younger. When I was younger, I was feeling more displaced because I didn't have access to communities. And now I have more interrelationships with Māori community and Chinese communities, mainly through art practice. So I think that displacement as I've got older has lessened. Yeah, and that's a really beautiful thing about having an art practice that explores those things is really grounding.
So your grandfather came first and then your grandmother followed?
He was 30 years older than her.
All right.
She was a young bride. And she was one of the first Chinese women in New Zealand that was allowed in, because before that was all men, yeah?
That's right, yeah. And this is your grandfather?
Grandfather, grandmother.
Wow, that's some serious history there, huh?
Interesting, eh? These are just bits of paper or instructions of how to get to my family village that I received from one of the old aunties, complete with the map. So there's Guangzhou, there's a railway track.
Just in case you decide to walk instead of take the train.
Yeah, Hong Kong's over here and Satao's here. My childhood was very free. We grew up by Port Chalmers, Sawyers Bay, jumping around and climbing trees and all that stuff, which was really good. So it was semi-rural. We had our fruit shop down in Port Chalmers, we had our market garden down there. It was always food related. So we've always had food central to who we are, as part of that Chinese community. I'm really interested in communities and individuals, about the evolution or the shifting and the changing of food practices and how we identify culturally, what's intact, what's being lost. And those kind of things and those memories were really, really important. So it was really interesting when my cousin was building this new space around the corner. He wanted to have something that was going to give back to the community and be identifiable and have something that was a point of difference. And how do we express, our family presence and our belonging within this city. Being able to tell those stories and reflect that presence that was here and has always been here but isn't visible anymore. So there's a really real importance because, as we grow as a nation, that's becoming more of a necessity. So what we're doing is starting to look at, new builds and how that can change and shift. So it's reflective of the relationships of mana whenua in this city. It's not just an add-on. We're getting into these projects really deep, to the extent of sort of assessing what their values are within their organisational practices. So how do those values that we're installing into the buildings and the look and feel start to maybe even inform how they deal with their practices? It helps to reflect, what this landscape and being part of this city is,
I have so much respect for how Simon's work is informed by his mixed heritage and how he has solidified his place not just in art fairs and galleries in New Zealand, but pretty much all around the world.
I think there's been quite a dramatic power shift in the art world in New Zealand. 30 or 40 years ago, contemporary Māori artists were, kind of shunned and not recognised by that community. And they bet that track for us to be where we are now, where there's a huge amount of interest from both sides of communities, from the Māori community and also the art community. There's that concept of tuakana tina that we have, which is, the older artists mentoring younger artists, and having it so that it's contextual to the tribal identity. So they're not coming in as individuals, they start to feel that they're part of a bigger picture and realise that the most important thing in our art practice isn't that art world. The most important thing comes back to the iwi.